In 2016, Britain held a plebiscite on its future in the European Union, and to the surprise of many, the British public voted to leave the EU. They did this even after their Prime Minister, David Cameron, negotiated concessions for Britain if it stayed in the bloc. Brexit reversed decades of political and economic integration, resulting in the nation declaring its independence from the European Federation, choosing to pursue its own destiny. Brexit was controversial because while the English overwhelmingly voted to leave the EU, with the exception of London, the Scots voted to stay. The vote to leave happened only a short time after Scotland held a plebiscite on whether to remain in a political union with England or not. Despite renewed calls for secession, Scotland stayed united with England and decided to defer to their preference to leave the EU. So this raises the question why the English are so Eurosceptical, and what are the origins of this? So to understand the psychology of the English, we have to turn to geography. If we look at this as a simple picture, we have an island, Great Britain, and a landmass, continental Europe. If we pretend we divide them into two states, one for the continent and one for the island, what would the power relationship be between these states? In this situation, Britain would be at the disadvantage. With the resources of the continent, that power could easily construct a navy, take hegemony of the sea, and reduce Britain to subordination. So this is the origin of the main British foreign policy goal, to keep Europe divided and England independent. For examples of British foreign policy in action, we can turn to history, looking at the country's conduct during the War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Great War, and World War II. As we mentioned, the main goal of the British is to keep Europe divided, as political unity for the continent means Britain losing its independence as a state. To keep Europe from unifying, historical British policy was to support the underdog, or weakest power, against whatever state was the closest to hegemony. The British are able to ally with the weakest power due to the Royal Navy. Because of their powerful fleet, Britain has immunity against invasion from any land power. Thus, they're in a unique position where they can antagonize and subvert the strongest state, whether that's the Habsburg monarchy, Napoleonic France, or Hitler's Germany. When the Habsburgs rose to power under Charles V and Philip II, England was one of the states that defied them, supporting the Dutch revolt and opposing them in the 30 Years' War. England itself had nearly found itself a part of the Habsburg monarchy. If Elizabeth's older sister, Queen Mary, had been fertile, then her marriage with Philip may have borne fruit, and England may well have become a province of the Habsburg Empire. This didn't happen, and Elizabeth ruled the country, changing to the new faith of Protestantism in defiance of the Habsburgs' effort at creating a universal empire. Dating back to the Middle Ages, France and Britain were almost continuously at war. By the time they reached the 18th century, their conflict had become like a new Sparta and Athens, a powerful land monarchy pitted against a naval mercantile power with a parliament. During the Revolution, France claimed to be spreading republicanism, liberty, and reason, but the republics they created around them became satellites of France. The English had their own constitution and Bill of Rights, so for them the battle was over French domination, not the moral rectitude of republics. When Napoleon came to the throne, the British would remain his most defiant enemy, famously defeating him at sea at Trafalgar, ensuring the British would maintain naval supremacy for the next century. One of France's errors was overthrowing the Spanish monarchy, wanting to impose their values on their ally. This led to anger, resentment, and a long guerrilla war in Spain, which, in addition to the French army being annihilated after invading Russia, led to their downfall. In the period from 1933 to 1938, the British knew they couldn't impose the terms of the Treaty of Versailles on Germany if the country chose to defy them, as it would involve an invasion and military occupation of Germany. They also knew that if the Germans were revanchist and wanted to occupy some of their smaller neighbors, it wouldn't be possible for the British to stop them. Thus, the British stood by indifferently through Hitler's early actions, hoping their accommodation would be appreciated by the Germans, and that after a few territorial adjustments, the country's revanchism would be sated. This made Britain's decision to declare war on Germany in 1939 important. At the time, Hitler had been gambling that the English had an ultimately callous, amoral, and imperial psychology, that they would do the value calculations of having to oppose him, and would conclude it would be easier to let him act, and then make a deal with him afterward. The British had stood by as Hitler built an army, stopped making reparations payments, left the League of Nations, remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and then conceded to him during the Sudetenland crisis. This period of Hitler's peaceful regime, from 1933 to 1938, brought an extraordinary diplomatic transformation for Germany. After rearming and being assertive of its interests, the Germans were able to stop paying reparations, declare political independence from the Versailles system, and renegotiate the political geography into something more favorable to them. They did this by threatening or getting close to war, but repeatedly coming short of war itself. Partly it was the hypocrisy of the Versailles Treaty, which the British were well aware of, that was why they permitted this. The moral principle of Versailles had been of ethnic self-determination, then this had been conveniently ignored whenever it benefited the Germans, like in the now diminished Austria being barred from uniting with the Weimar Republic. Hitler's problem was he was too belligerent and impatient. He has several instances where he can stop, consolidate his political situation, and allow states to accept his territorial adjustments as long-term changes. But he keeps attacking, not understanding the importance of soft power or the banality of history. We analyze this part of Hitler's psychology in detail in another video. And then in contrast to this, the British are the opposite and understand the importance of time as a principle. During the Victorian period, the British followed a policy of splendid isolation, looking after their self-interest, but remaining without entangling alliances. With control of the seas, they began seeking to create efficiencies in trade, benefiting from the income gained from matching buyers and sellers of goods across vast distances. The British eventually experimented with forms of settler colonialism, sending colonists to Canada, New England, and Australia. They also created protectorates, countries that came under the military protection of the English and economically integrated into their market. It was this policy that gave the English market increasing access to resources, which allowed for greater development. Predating the idea of free trade, the British Empire was one of the first expressions of economic integration as a political idea. Infrastructure and efficiencies at resource extraction were the primary investments in protectorates. The goods would then be moved to the British Isles, where the workshop of the world would engage in manufacturing. Everything then became accessible for purchase on the British market. In a different world, the British Empire could have transformed into an imperial federation, a union of shared history, values, and identity, continuing its program of shared economic development. But this did not come about. Its colonies developed national identities of their own, felt they were not gaining enough from the imperial project, and broke free to pursue their own destinies. The first reference to Britain as perfidious occurs in the 17th century, when a French preacher accuses their foreign policy as being duplicitous and self-interested, that the British would make deals and break them when they were no longer beneficial. This is the second advantage that comes out of Britain's geography. Not only can it support weaker powers against hegemons because it's an island, it's also able to be entirely self-interested and not respect long-term agreements, as there is no way for a land power to punish them for duplicitous behavior. To understand the origins of Britain's defiant diplomacy, you have to remember its position on an island. If you're in continental Europe, your reputation is more important to you because of the danger of foreign invasion. Because Britain is immune to invasion as long as it maintains its navy, It's able to join and leave deals based on whether participating is advantageous to its national interests. Because Europe is so divided by its nationalities, it's been difficult to unite it under one leader. After 2 world wars, one clear value of the EU is the idea of pacifism. Due to this, the English can no longer prevent the unification of Europe. At the same time, due to the pacifist nature of the Europeans, they're no longer a military danger to England, like the regimes of Napoleon and Hitler were. Thus, European integration causes a psychological crisis for the English. For centuries, their identity was built around the ideas of stubborn defiance and independence, especially against totalitarian rule. Under the EU, for a time they were peacefully integrating in a pan-European unification movement, which seemed to contradict their historical policy. What this means is with Brexit, the English took a step towards self-consciousness as a people, seeing value in preserving their own group, independence, and identity as a culture. It makes sense that the country would at the same time take a step toward anti-immigrant policies, which would be in accord with this value. In a previous video, we looked at the moral taste buds, and we find the English value the matrix of loyalty to the group, something visible in other cultures like the Japanese. However, this causes Britain to be in a puzzling situation. In real power terms, it's now an economic isolate, standing beside the European bloc. Understanding self-interest in trade, there is no incentive for the Europeans to offer preferable deals after the English decided to leave the common market. Thus, as global trade continues to improve and become more efficient, the idea of Britain integrating with its long-distance cultural children becomes worth considering. So this is a proposal some have been making, that if your country has a shared English identity, a goal should be political confederation to preserve that into the future. This already exists partially through NATO, through the Five Eyes, and through the special relationship between Britain and the United States. But this situation could be transformed into a true political union. If we did this, it would be a big transformation for the English national consciousness, going from being the hereditary progenitor of Canada and Australia to being turned into a subordinate province of the group. At the same time, the common language, values, and institutions make such a union self-evident. If we look at France during the de Gaulle period, their behavior offers us some insight into the psychology of Brexit. Experiencing defeat in World War II, and then losing their colonial empire during decolonization, the French lost a sense of identity as a people. Under de Gaulle, you can see an expression of this when France leaves NATO right in the middle of the Cold War, and for a time pursues an independent foreign policy. So this was a reassertion of the independence of France, and a national recollection of its Victorian great power, not wanting to quietly submit to the American-led order. At the same time, the benefits of joining NATO and the American-led global economy was too difficult to resist. So then you see France working through this, seeing the benefits of pan-Europeanism, and them rejoining the defense agreement. So the English are going through their own form of this process. A very traumatizing event after World War II was the Suez Canal crisis. And this was when the Soviets and Americans were making decisions for global policy and could completely ignore the preferences of the old empires, Britain and France. So the realization their nations didn't have the power that they used to, and trying to understand what their new place is in the world, is expressed in their politics. So again, it appears some kind of union with the other English-speaking states may be in the political future for the British. This union of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom would be a confederation for the English. A final speculation would be to take this union and then integrate it with the United States. However, this would cause anxiety over losing de facto independence, since the United States would politically and economically dominate the group. At the same time, it presents an interesting vision of the future, a return of empire in the 21st century.